Welcome to the Fun Astrology and Merriman Market Analyst Saturday Financial Podcast. I'm Thomas Miller. Thanks for joining us. This is the free weekly newsletter published every weekend on MMAcycles.com, written by financial astrologer and market analyst Ray Merriman. We start off with a quote from Bloomberg on Friday. Emerging markets were swept up in the global equities storm Friday, set for the biggest daily drop since August, as investor concerns over U.S. President Donald Trump's trade threats and the fading prospect of a Ukraine ceasefire put pressure on risk assets. End quote. And now we look back before we look forward, the weekend past review before we pick up for next week's short-term geocosmics. Ray says it's never easy when a personal planet turns retrograde, as Venus is doing this weekend. In these instances, trend, chart, and technical indicators often reverse. Price structures break down or up sharply. Yet, approximately half the time, these turn out to be false breakouts or breakdowns. Last week, a number of global stock indices broke down, falling below the levels that started their primary cycle, which means the trend has turned bearish. This also fits with the intermediate-term cycles message, which points to a 50-week and 3-year cycle low due this year. Yet, this breakdown is happening within the time band of Venus turning retrograde, which has a higher than usual correspondence to false signals. So which will it be this time? A breakout or a fake-out? This predicament is discussed in a special update report that was issued on Friday, February 28th. It went out to all subscribers of the new MMA Cycles Technology Report. It also will be covered in depth in the weekly subscription reports that go out on Saturday from MMAcycles.com. So what moved the global stock markets to behave so schizoid last week? The on again, off again, back on again, tariffs for some countries but not for others. The markets that fell hardest were those in the U.S. and where the tariffs were on again, as this stokes fear of higher inflation and disruption of supplies of goods. The markets that did well were those not subject to tariffs as of the last pronouncement. But under retrograde chaos, that could change at any moment again. European indices were the main beneficiary of rallies last week. The Zurich SMI soared to a new all-time high on February 26th, while the German DAX, Netherlands AEX, and London FTSE came close. It was also a positive week for the Hang Seng of Hong Kong, which rallied to its highest level in 3 years. China's Shanghai Composite was also in positive territory until the U.S. tariffs against China were announced on Friday. But Australia's ASX, Japanese Nikkei, and especially India's Nifty indices took a pounding, with the Nifty collapsing to its lowest mark in over 8 months. In the U.S., where tariffs are the equivalent of new taxes, i.e. higher prices, on consumers, the results were dramatic. The Nasdaq broke below the start of its primary cycle, which is a strong sign of a new bear market beginning. The S&P and Dow Jones Industrial Average are still above their January lows, which one might argue is setting up a case for bullish intermarket divergence. However, currently, all are experiencing a case of intermarket bearish divergence off the all-time high in the S&P that was on February 19th and has not been matched by the other indices. So that seems to be the leading indicator that is valid at the moment. Although Venus turning retrograde could support the more bullish divergence signal, perhaps it would only be short-term. Gold followed a similar path. It made a new all-time high of $29.74 on Monday, but by Friday it was nearly $100 lower. The decline was even steeper in silver, where prices tanked to $31.36 on Friday, well off of its high of $34.56 back on Valentine's Day, February 14th. Another loser was Bitcoin last week, which fell to a low of $78,723 on Friday, a loss of over 217% from its all-time high of $109,071 back on January 20th. This is right into the zone given for a decline in our recent Forecast 2025 webinar, which was presented on February 16th. That webinar has described the recent declines in metals and Bitcoin almost perfectly. Recordings are still available and valuable if you haven't seen it yet, MMAcycles.com. Two other markets which declined last week but showed signs of a Venus retrograde reversal readying are crude and soybeans. Now the short-term geocosmics, a quote from Wednesday's Wall Street Journal. A Trump blather, it says, blaming Ukraine for not negotiating, segued into something he clearly didn't mean, yet now his team must mumblingly agree Ukraine started the war, end quote. Another quote from Friday's Wall Street Journal. Trump tempered some of his harshest criticisms of Ukraine, saying he, quote, can't believe he once called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator, and vowing to help Kyiv reclaim as much seized territory from Russia as possible, end quote. And another line from James Clavell from Shogun. By universal custom, your enemy is never more polite than when he is planning or has planned your destruction, end quote. Now for this week's short-term geocosmics, Ray first says, a correction of last week's report. Adam Sommer, who wrote the excellent article on the Chiron return in the United States chart that I quoted, did not create the first astrology podcast as written. I was mistaken. Adam was one of the firsts, so was Gary Caton, the Hermetic Astrology podcast, a year before Sommer, and the late Kelly Lee Phillips about 4 years earlier. It's good to get the history right, something I wish could take place more often in the world, such as how world leaders recount the history of who actually started the current war between Russia and Ukraine. In financial market news, President Trump proves once again that he is the master at solving problems that only he can create. In typical retrograde chaos fashion, diplomacy starts, then regresses, then starts again, then regresses again. And markets react to each initiative, then backstep, creating an ongoing and deepening sense of confusion that borders on a crisis threatening to wreak havoc on global stock markets. With Venus turning retrograde, don't expect this pattern to change quickly. In fact, Mercury will also turn retrograde March 15th, and both will cross over the 0 degrees Aries world point, along with Neptune during the last week of March. This just also happens to fall on the midheaven of the Federal Reserve Board chart, forming a T-square to its Sun-Pluto opposition. March through early April is also the period when transiting Saturn will T-square President Trump's Sun-Moon opposition with his lunar nodes. Not to mention, there will be both a solar and lunar eclipse in March as well. Still, some markets may actually benefit from these cosmic conditions, especially those that are due for primary or half-primary cycle lows, such as grains, metals, and cryptos. This is a wild and wacky time with both Venus and soon Mercury retrograde together. It can make for excellent short-term trading, but it can also correspond to great frustration for both traders and political world leaders who are either not nimble and able to adjust positions quickly, or too nimble and changing positions too often. Timing is an issue that will make the difference between successfully navigating this period or going crazy. If ever there was a time to practice meditation and deep breathing before acting out, this is one of those instances. And fortunately, Neptune, the planet supporting the pursuit of inner peace, will also be highlighted in March. And that concludes this week's newsletter. Next weekend, the whole MMA gang basically is going to be in Orlando for the Cosmic Patterns Astrology Conference, March 7th through 9th. If you go to the newsletter at MMAcycles.com, in the very first announcement, there is a link to that if you're interested. I hear that our own Elisa Dixon is going to be there, so we'll get a good report from her. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend. I'll see you back on Monday, and we do have a lot to talk about next week as we follow on from our intentions created Thursday night during the new moon. So have a great restful weekend, and we'll see you back on Monday.